World War II ends. The longest war in modern history begins. On one side, the modern army of France. Opposing it, a guerrilla army fighting in the jungles and paddy fields. It flies the banner of communism, but offers independence. So begins 3 decades of war, which will drag the superpowers ever deeper into a distant quicksand called Vietnam. After the ruin of World War II, France plans to regain its former colonies. Its most prized overseas possession is Indochina, comprising Laos, Cambodia, and Vietnam. During World War II, Vietnam is occupied by Japan, but the area is relatively peaceful. Vietnam's economy is based on rubber and rice. France took over Vietnam in the 1860s, for 80 years exploiting its peasant labor. Resistance to the colonial administration is sometimes violent. A Hanoi strategist and veteran of the Indochina War, Colonel Ha Van Lao.
Comme tous les jeunes Vietnamiens en ce moment,
like all the young Vietnamese at that time, under the domination of the French colonialists, we felt that our liberty was gone. We felt that we were no longer independent. In colonialist days, from a political point of view, the word patriot was a synonym for criminal, and patriots were treated as such. That is to say, prison. There were more prisons than schools. Independence and liberty were empty words.
One punishment for insurrection, public execution. As anti-colonial sentiment grows, a charismatic figure arrives to lead a movement for independence. Ho Chi Minh sees the Americans as best able to keep the French from returning to Vietnam. Elder statesman Dean Rusk, then a deputy chief of staff in Asia.
At one point in '44, various Frenchmen turned up out there asking to be parachuted into Indochina. So we in Stillwell's headquarters sent a message back to our own chiefs of staff saying, request guidance on American policy toward Indochina. And for months and months, nothing happened. Finally, a Joint Chiefs of Staff paper arrived, headed U.S. Policy Toward Indochina. And it said, when asked by the Joint Chiefs of Staff for a statement of U.S. policy on Indochina, President Roosevelt replied, I don't want to hear any more about Indochina. History could have been very different had Mr. Roosevelt and then Mr. Truman pressed that policy more strongly.
For a time, the Vietnamese communists and America become allies. The guerrillas assemble for the first time in December 1944. With Ho Chi Minh is a former history teacher and gifted military strategist, Bo Nguyen Chap. A dedicated revolutionary, Ho Chi Minh wants all possible recognition. America provides aid and small arms to Ho's Vietnam Liberation Front, the Viet Minh. Maintaining a gentle image, Ho downplays his communism. He is known as a nationalist leader. Agents of the OSS, the CIA's predecessor, are sent in as advisors. They include Major Archimedes Patty.
Ho Chi Minh was actually providing the Allies, with information and protection of downed pilots and crewmen, both from the Navy in the Pacific and from the 14th Air Force in China.
As the Japanese occupation spreads throughout the country, the Viet Minh and the Americans collaborate. Ho's men strike at Japanese outposts, then melt away. As many as 50 Americans now help train the Viet Minh, and at times join the fighting.
It was combat. It was a very small operation as far as the war is concerned, but nevertheless, it is true that they did work with the Viet Minh against the Japanese. Then later, Giap and his Viet Minh crew went out to attack several Japanese outposts with our men after they had been trained by the Americans in the use of grenade launchers and flamethrowers and rifles, machine guns, BARs, and so on.
From its humble start, and with American help, the guerrilla army becomes a formidable force, cutting deeply into Japanese lines. The tenacity of the mountain fighters helps their cause. Villages are won over, new recruits come in. Women join in the hardest fighting. By 1945, the guerrilla forces claim a membership of 500,000, mostly in the northern and central regions. The Viet Minh now believes it will have enough popular support for a national government. For Ho Chi Minh, the approaching end of World War II is a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity to throw out the French. He has returned to Vietnam after 32 years in exile. Ho Chi Minh is then little known even to his own people. Born in 1890 in central Vietnam, Ho's youth is influenced by his highly nationalist father and by the Marxist Revolution. The young Ho in exile denounces French colonialism at the Socialist Congress in 1920. That same year, he helps found the French Communist Party. He takes menial jobs, from cabin boy to pastry cook, and writes political articles under the alias Nguyen Ai Quoc, or Nguyen the Patriot. Using different aliases, he travels, preaching revolution. The transition from ardent young rebel to political leader takes more than 30 years. In August 1945, the Japanese surrender, and Ho's guerrilla forces seize power, occupying Hanoi. On September 2nd, Ho Chi Minh declares independence. The middle class and Vietnam's Catholics are apprehensive, but nationalists and communists are overjoyed. Ho becomes his country's first president. The public celebration in Hanoi's Ba Dinh Square is recalled by American agent Archimedes Patty.
It was a very touching ceremony. I could tell from the reaction from the crowd, and the crowd was fantastic. Ho was very anxious for recognition. He actually always kept harping on the point, why don't the United States give us moral support? We don't want anything else from them. Nothing but moral support.
But America steps aside. The U.S. needs its European allies in the developing struggle against communism. The French reoccupy Vietnam. Colonialism returns. With no more American help, Ho Chi Minh first advocates cooperation with the French. Their response is to make Vietnam semi-autonomous. In 1946, Ho travels to France to negotiate, but finds no real political independence. Back in Hanoi, Ho tells his compatriots the terms are unacceptable. November 1946. The war begins. Efforts at negotiations collapse. The Viet Minh government now operates in hiding. The French deploy their modern arsenal, planes, tanks, and artillery, confident they can rout the guerrilla forces. They crash into the countryside in classical pincer thrusts. But they're vulnerable to ambush. The Viet Minh are elusive. The major communist forces keep slipping through the conventional battle lines. Although the French capture many Viet Minh camps, the guerrillas are able to disperse and regroup. The Viet Minh are aided by the peasants who provide food and shelter. North Vietnam strategist Ha Van Lao.
It was like water and fish. We had an expression that said, the Viet Minh fighters worked among the people like fish in water.
Ho Chi Minh directs the war from the mountain jungles along the Chinese border. The French attempt a bold gamble to finish the war in a single operation. They send 15,000 men into the almost inaccessible border terrain. French paratroopers actually land on Ho Chi Minh's headquarters and find his mail ready for signature. But the leaders have fled. The war shifts back to the lowlands. The French begin punitive raids on villages assisting the Viet Minh. They forcibly evacuate entire regions, creating a vast refugee problem and resentment. But the nights belong to the guerrillas. The French are safe only in the cities. There are 3 years of sporadic, inconclusive fighting. To the rest of the world, it is an obscure Asian conflict. But in December 1949, Mao Zedong's communist victory in China shocks America into increasing concern about events in Asia. Mao now provides modern weapons and training sanctuaries for the Viet Minh. The war is on an irreversible course. In 1949, the People's Liberation Army is a large, disciplined force with widespread popular support. A foreign ideology, communism, is now identified with patriotism. In the struggle between communism and Western power, America worries about French endurance. Dean Rosk.
We did not press the French to the point where they would simply withdraw and say, okay, it's yours, you worry about it. We didn't want to push them that far because we didn't want Indochina on our hands. Now, during the Truman years, we did talk about some ideas which later became the Cito Treaty. But in the Truman administration, we rejected these ideas, because we thought it would be a mistake for the United States to go into Southeast Asia and make an alliance with some and not all of the states in that region, and have the involvement of the United States become a divisive element in Southeast Asia.
In Saigon, Bao Dai heads a French-appointed government which the U.S. formally recognizes in 1950. But China and the Soviet Union recognize only Ho as leader of all Vietnam. Bao Dai had previously been emperor under French colonial rule. He remains unpopular, and Viet Minh influence spreads. In 1950, the U.S. extends military aid, But one condition is the formation of a Vietnamese national army. This early Vietnamization fails. The officers are an elite class who avoid battle. In June 1950, the North Korean army attacks across the 38th parallel. In November, 180,000 Chinese troops enter the Korean War. It seems like united communism is on the move. American troops assume the major share in another land war in Asia. In Vietnam by this time, Chinese aid dooms any prospect of full French victory. The Viet Minh receives heavy mortars, pack howitzers, and complete artillery battalions. The Viet Minh commander, General Giap, trains his forces for their biggest assault on the French. He targets the string of French forts along the Chinese border. The Viet Minh go after them one by one, surprising the French with their Chinese weaponry. All the French border garrisons fall in overwhelming assaults. The French lose 6,000 troops killed or captured. It is the worst defeat of the war and a portent of things to come. French author-historian Jean Lacouture.
That was the first disaster of the war, and that gave the idea that the war was nearly impossible to win that war, because the Chinese Revolutionary Army was on the border, and with, the Viet Minh with China behind him, was, of course, it was the great, enormous sanctuary. So the war couldn't be really won, and it became more and more unpopular.
The communists now control Vietnam north of the Red River Delta. They have all-weather roads running in from China. America sends in planes and other military hardware to help the French hold the Delta. The heavily populated Delta is the key territory in the war. The communist objective is to defeat the French before the arrival of more American aid. The first target is Vinh Nguyen, an important road junction near Hanoi. The Viet Minh offensive begins with such complete surprise that at first the French press predict the fall of Hanoi. But the Viet Minh has misjudged the moment for open warfare. The new French commander, General de Tassigny, redirects the defense with fresh reinforcements. The French assemble all available aircraft for saturation napalm strikes. They catch thousands of Viet Minh in the open. Severely defeated at Vinh Nguyen, General Giap launches 2 more assaults on the Red River Delta in 1951. Both fail with heavy losses. Giap's forces need time to ponder the bloody lessons of the Delta defeats. While it rebuilds, the Viet Minh High Command deploys terrorist units in the cities. The war now reaches to Saigon. Homemade bombs spread destruction in marketplaces and theaters, even schools. Explosive-loaded bicycle pumps detonate outside the National Assembly. Assassination squads roam freely at night, killing supporters of the French authorities. In 1953, Giap invades French-ruled Laos. He deploys his divisions carefully, fighting a war of movement with very little encounter. Giap controls the countryside, by keeping the French tied down. For the French, the war becomes an exhaustive search. They seldom lose battles, but they cannot gain decisive victory. Refugees in the tens of thousands become the symbol of a losing war. The Viet Minh force is steadily growing. The French slowly lose territory, and with it, the military initiative. It is now politically impossible to send more troops. In France, anti-war demonstrations spread in the cities. After 8 years, there's a growing war weariness. The government tries a change in the military command. General Henri Navarre is sent over.
The Viet Minh had gained a considerable advantage over us in mobile forces, and the situation had deteriorated the previous year. In 1952, we had to evacuate all the upper region and a good part of Laos, as Viet Minh were in the port of Luang Prabang. Therefore, the military situation was very bad. If we had wanted to win the war, France would have had to make a great effort in Indochina, and the French political situation would absolutely not have allowed this. France was tired of the war. She would have agreed at most to a very limited effort, but she was unable to make the greater effort necessary to win the war. Even if she had been, I doubt it could have been possible.
In May 1953, Navarre draws up a map, the shaded areas showing the extent of Viet Minh control. Navarre formulates a plan to stop further Viet Minh expansion. He seeks to build a strong mobile force to regain the initiative and to force the Viet Minh to negotiate.
What we could do was to work out an honorable exit from the war, in which France would maintain a cultural and economic influence in Indochina, but it would have been impossible to win the war.
Navarre launches a major assault in the central area of Hue and Quang Tri. Supported by carrier-launched attack aircraft, French forces move ashore. Their target, an elusive Viet Minh infantry regiment concealed in the sandy coastal flats. But once again, the Viet Minh slips away. When the French pull out, the communists resume operations. So it goes, until Navarre's plan fails. After 7 years of war, France has lost 74,000 troops and has another 190,000 bogged down. The most bitter fighting is yet to come. The Korean armistice in July 1953 allows alternatives in Vietnam. China and the United States are now freed from direct confrontation. They can concentrate on ending the Vietnam War or on escalating it. Korea becomes the model. Negotiate only from strength. American military aid is rushed to Vietnam, but the French public is turning against the war. U.S. Vice President Richard Nixon arrives in Vietnam in late 1953. He tells the French a peace settlement would place people under communist bondage. It is impossible to lay down arms until victory is won, says Nixon. Influential Americans come to agree. So does the French government. It will continue the war. The U.S. will finance 80% of the cost, $800 million. But the basic problem remains. France is an occupying power. It lacks the popular support to make American aid effective. The French must still count on maneuvering the Viet Minh into a decisive set-piece battle. Very soon, they get their chance. They choose the battleground, deploying 15,000 men. The Viet Minh accept the challenge. They assemble their main divisions and new heavy weapons. Each side believes it can outgun the other. For each, it is a turning point in history, the Battle of Dien Bien Phu.